The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Harry's Montecito home, casting long shadows across the marble floors. He sat at his breakfast table, coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared at his phone screen. The news alert had just arrived, and the words seemed to blur together as he read them again and again. His father, King Charles III, had made a decision that would change everything. Harry's chest tightened as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. The royal family's latest announcement wasn't just another piece of protocol or ceremony planning. This was personal, and it cut deeper than any previous slight or disagreement. Meghan walked into the kitchen, her silk robe flowing behind her as she moved to pour herself tea. She noticed Harry's expression immediately, the way his jaw was set and his eyes had that distant look she knew too well. It was the same expression he wore whenever news from the palace arrived, but this time seemed different. This time, there was something almost broken in his gaze. "What is it now?" she asked gently, setting her cup down and moving to stand behind his chair. Her hands found his shoulders, which were rigid with tension. Harry handed her the phone without speaking. As Meghan read, her own expression shifted from curiosity to concern, then to something approaching anger. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. "They've really done it this time," she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and hurt that mirrored Harry's own feelings. The decision from Buckingham Palace was unprecedented in its implications for Harry's future relationship with the royal family. King Charles, in his effort to streamline the monarchy and address ongoing controversies, had made a choice that lumped Harry's situation together with that of Prince Andrew. The comparison was devastating, not just politically but emotionally. Prince Andrew, who had been effectively exiled from royal duties following the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, was now being treated by the palace as part of the same category as Harry. The palace's new guidelines for non-working royals made no distinction between someone who had stepped back to forge their own path and someone who had been pushed out due to scandal. Harry stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the large window that overlooked their garden, where their children often played. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was looking out at the life he had chosen, the peaceful existence he and Meghan had built for themselves and their family, while feeling more disconnected from his birth family than ever before. The phone began ringing almost immediately. First, it was his publicist, then his security team, followed by friends from both sides of the Atlantic. The news was spreading quickly, and everyone wanted to know how Harry was responding to this latest development from the palace. But Harry wasn't ready to respond. He wasn't even sure how he felt yet. The numbness was familiar, the same protective mechanism that had kicked in when his mother died, when he'd left military service, when he and Meghan had first announced their intention to step back from royal duties. It was his mind's way of protecting him from the full impact of emotional trauma until he was ready to process it. Meghan answered the phone calls while Harry remained at the window. She could see him wrestling with emotions that ran much deeper than anger or disappointment. This wasn't just about royal protocol or public perception. This was about a son feeling rejected by his father in the most public way possible. The afternoon brought a stream of news coverage that made everything worse. Television presenters and royal commentators dissected every aspect of the king's decision, comparing Harry and Andrew in ways that felt deliberately cruel. Some defended the streamlining effort, calling it necessary modernization. Others criticized it as tone-deaf and unnecessarily harsh toward Harry, who had served his country with distinction before choosing a different path. Harry finally spoke as the sun was setting, his voice hoarse as if he'd been shouting, though he'd barely said a word all day. "I served in Afghanistan," he said to Meghan, still looking out the window. "I created the Invictus Games. I've spent my entire adult life trying to honor my mother's legacy and serve others. And now I'm being treated the same as..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The comparison to Andrew wasn't just professionally damaging, it was personally devastating. Andrew had been stripped of his titles and duties due to his association with a convicted sex offender. Harry had voluntarily stepped back to protect his family and pursue independent charitable work. That evening, Harry sat in his study, surrounded by photos from his military service and charitable endeavors. There were pictures of him with wounded veterans, children in Africa, and families affected by various causes he'd championed. Each image seemed to mock the palace's decision to lump him in with someone whose reputation was built on scandal rather than service. The phone rang again, but this time it was a number Harry recognized. His brother William was calling, the first direct contact they'd had in months. Harry stared at the phone, letting it ring several times before finally answering. "Harry," William's voice was careful, formal. "William. I wanted you to hear this from me before you read it anywhere else," William continued. "I had nothing to do with Father's decision. I actually advised against it." The admission hung in the air between them. It was the closest thing to support Harry had received from his immediate family in years, but it also confirmed that the decision had been discussed among family members without his input. "But you didn't stop it," Harry said quietly. "I'm not the king, Harry. You know how this works." Harry did know how it worked. He'd grown up understanding the hierarchy, the chain of command, the way decisions flowed down from the monarch without room for dissent or discussion. But knowing how it worked didn't make it hurt any less when that system was used against him. After the call ended, Harry sat in silence for a long time. The house around him was quiet. Meghan had taken the children upstairs for their bedtime routine, and he could hear the faint sounds of bathwater running and bedtime stories being read. It was the life he'd chosen, the peace he'd sought when he left royal duties behind. But tonight, that peace felt fragile. The palace's decision wasn't just about protocol or public relations. It was about his identity, his worth, and his place in a family that seemed determined to remind him that leaving came with consequences he couldn't have anticipated. As Harry finally made his way upstairs, he passed the children's rooms and heard Meghan's gentle voice reading a story about a prince who gave up his crown to save his kingdom. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the warmth in her voice or the contentment in their children's responses. He had given up his crown, in a sense. He'd traded the certainty of royal life for the uncertainty of independence. Most days, he felt good about that choice. Tonight, however, the cost seemed higher than he'd ever imagined it could be. The decision from Buckingham Palace was more than just administrative reorganization. It was a message, sent in the most public way possible, about what the royal family thought of Harry's choices and his current value to the institution. Being lumped together with Andrew wasn't just unfortunate, it was devastating, and it marked a new low in his relationship with the family he'd been born into. As Harry prepared for bed, he realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more phone calls, more media coverage, and more questions about his response to his father's decision. But tonight, all he could do was try to process the reality that the gap between him and his birth family had grown even wider, and that bridge building would be more difficult than ever before. The story was far from over, but this first chapter had been written by others, and Harry was left to figure out how to respond to decisions made without his input that would affect his reputation and relationships for years to come. The second day after the palace announcement dawned gray and drizzling, matching Harry's mood perfectly. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night replaying conversations from years past, wondering if there had been signs that this moment was inevitable. Meghan had found him at dawn, sitting on their back patio with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring at nothing. The media response had been even more brutal than anticipated. Headlines screamed across every major publication, both in Britain and internationally. Some were sympathetic, questioning the wisdom of King Charles's decision. Others were gleeful, treating Harry's inclusion in the problematic royals category as long overdue comeuppance for his criticism of the royal family. Prince Harry's fall from grace complete, read one particularly harsh headline. From war hero to royal outcast, Harry's journey to disgrace, proclaimed another. The most painful ones were those that included side-by-side photos of Harry and Andrew, as if their situations were truly equivalent. Harry's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from journalists seeking comment. His team had issued a brief statement about having no immediate response, but the pressure for a more substantial reaction was mounting. Every major television network wanted an interview. Publishers were already reaching out about book deals that would allow Harry to tell his side of the story. But Harry wasn't ready to tell any story yet. He was still trying to understand how he felt about being the subject of one. Meghan joined him on the patio, bringing fresh tea and sitting in the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching their children's playground equipment drip with morning moisture. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that felt almost surreal given the chaos surrounding them. "I keep thinking about what this means for Archie and Lilibet," Harry finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "They're going to grow up reading about how their grandfather lumped their father in with a disgraced uncle. How do I explain that to them?" Meghan reached over and took his hand. "We'll figure it out when the time comes. Right now, they're too young to understand any of this. By the time they're old enough to ask questions, maybe things will be different." Harry appreciated her optimism, but he wasn't sure he shared it. The royal family had long memories, and decisions made at this level weren't easily reversed. King Charles had clearly decided that streamlining the monarchy was more important than protecting Harry's reputation or their relationship as father and son. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Harry's longtime friend and former private secretary had flown in from London overnight. Edward Cranfield had worked with Harry during some of his most challenging years as a working royal, and his sudden appearance meant the situation was being taken very seriously by people who understood royal protocol better than almost anyone. "This is bad, Harry," Edward said without preamble as they sat in Harry's study. "Worse than I think you realize. The palace isn't just reorganizing, they're sending a message. And that message is that you're as much of a liability as Andrew." Harry winced at the blunt assessment, but he appreciated Edward's honesty. "What are people saying?" "Really saying, not the public statements. The working royals are keeping quiet publicly, but privately, there's a lot of discomfort with the decision. Some of the senior courtiers think it was unnecessarily harsh. But Charles is determined to present a united front. He's not backing down." Edward pulled out a folder containing press clippings and social media analysis. The public reaction was mixed but intense. Harry's supporters were outraged, seeing the decision as petty revenge for his criticisms of the royal family. His critics were celebrating what they viewed as appropriate consequences for someone who had betrayed the crown. What struck Harry most was how the decision was being interpreted differently depending on people's existing opinions about him. Those who supported his decision to step back saw this as vindictive punishment. Those who criticized his departure saw it as justified accountability. There seemed to be no middle ground, no space for nuanced understanding of the complexity of the situation. The afternoon brought a conference call with Harry's legal team. There were questions about whether the palace's decision affected any existing agreements or arrangements. More concerning were the implications for Harry's charitable work and business ventures. Being categorized with Andrew could affect partnerships, sponsorships, and Harry's ability to represent various causes. "The Invictus Games Foundation is already getting questions," his lawyer reported. "Some sponsors want reassurance that your new status won't affect the game's reputation. We're managing it, but it's a concern." Harry felt sick. The Invictus Games were perhaps his greatest professional achievement, a Paralympic-style competition for wounded veterans that had grown from his personal experience serving alongside injured soldiers. The thought that his father's decision might harm an organization that helped veterans heal through sport was almost unbearable. As evening approached, Harry found himself in his children's playroom, surrounded by toys and books that reminded him why he'd made the choices that led to this moment. He'd left royal life to protect his family, to give his children a different kind of childhood than he'd had. But now it seemed like those very children might pay a price for his decisions that he hadn't anticipated. Meghan found him there, sitting on a small chair designed for a toddler, looking lost among the bright colors and innocent chaos of childhood. "I've been thinking," she said, settling on the floor beside him. "Maybe this is actually an opportunity." Harry looked at her skeptically. "How is being lumped in with Andrew an opportunity?" "Because it forces you to define yourself completely on your own terms," she replied. "You've been trying to maintain some connection to royal life, keeping one foot in that world while building a new one. Maybe this is the universe telling you to commit fully to the path you've chosen." It was a perspective Harry hadn't considered. Since stepping back from royal duties, he'd maintained a complicated relationship with his former life. He'd kept some honorary titles, maintained certain protocols, and always held out hope that his relationship with his family might improve. perhaps Meghan was right that this decision, painful as it was, might force a clarity that had been missing. That evening, Harry sat down to write for the first time since the announcement. Not a public statement or a response to the media, but a private letter to himself, trying to work through his feelings about what had happened and what it might mean for his future. He wrote about the boy who'd lost his mother and found purpose in service. About the young man who'd struggled with his role but tried to honor his family's expectations. About the husband and father who'd chosen love and independence over duty and tradition. And about the man he was becoming, someone who might have to forge a completely independent path without looking back. The letter became several pages long, filled with questions as much as statements. What did it mean to be a prince if your own father didn't want you associated with the crown? How do you honor a heritage that seems determined to reject you? Where do you find your identity when the institution that shaped you decides you're no longer welcome? As Harry wrote, he realized that some of his pain came from still caring deeply about his family's approval. Despite everything that had happened, despite the choices he'd made and the independence he'd claimed, part of him was still the younger son seeking his father's love and acceptance. But another part of him, the part that had grown stronger since marrying Meghan and becoming a father himself, was beginning to feel something different. Not just hurt, but a kind of angry clarity. If his father wanted to treat him like a liability, if the institution wanted to lump him together with someone whose reputation was built on scandal, then perhaps it was time to stop seeking their approval altogether. The phone rang late that evening. It was his cousin Zara, calling from England with words of support that meant more than any public statement could have. "This is rubbish, Harry," she said simply. "Everyone knows it. Uncle Charles is making a mistake, and I think he knows it too." The call was brief but meaningful. It reminded Harry that while his relationship with the institution of the monarchy might be irreparably damaged, his relationships with individual family members were more complex and, in some cases, still salvageable. As Harry finally headed to bed, he felt exhausted but slightly more centered than he had the night before. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a different kind of resolve. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more questions about his response and his future. But tonight, he felt like he was beginning to understand that his father's decision, devastating as it was, might also be a kind of liberation. The second day of this new reality was ending, but Harry was beginning to sense that it might mark the beginning of a different kind of story than the one he'd been telling himself about his relationship with the royal family. A story where he stopped waiting for acceptance that might never come and started building something entirely his own. The third week after King Charles's decision brought unexpected developments that would test Harry's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a painful but private family matter was evolving into something much more complex and public. Harry woke that Tuesday morning to find Meghan already dressed and on the phone in their home office. Her tone was sharp, professional, and clearly frustrated. When she saw Harry in the doorway, she held up one finger, indicating she needed to finish the conversation. "No, that's absolutely not acceptable," she was saying. "We had an agreement, and nothing in that agreement mentioned anything about Prince Harry's current status affecting our partnership. I suggest you reconsider your position before we involve our legal team." Harry felt his stomach drop. The phone call was clearly about one of their business ventures, and it seemed the palace's decision was having the ripple effects his team had warned about. When Meghan hung up, her expression was grim. "Netflix is getting cold feet about the documentary series," she explained. "They're not canceling yet, but they want to reassess the project in light of recent developments. They're concerned about being associated with someone the palace has essentially grouped with Andrew." Harry sat down heavily in the chair across from Meghan's desk. This was exactly what he'd feared most, that his father's decision would damage not just his reputation but his ability to support his family and continue his charitable work. The documentary series was meant to highlight mental health initiatives and veteran support programs, causes that mattered deeply to Harry. "There's more," Meghan continued, her voice gentle but firm. "The Archwell Foundation received a call yesterday. 3 major donors are reconsidering their commitments. And there are questions being raised about your patronage of several organizations." The weight of the consequences was becoming clearer each day. Harry had thought the worst part of his father's decision was the emotional betrayal, the public humiliation of being categorized with Andrew. But now he was seeing that the practical implications might be even more devastating. Harry spent the morning on calls with his business manager, his publicist, and the heads of several organizations he supported. The conversations were difficult and frustrating. Everyone was supportive privately, but publicly, there was nervousness about association with someone the palace had effectively distanced itself from. The most painful call was with the CEO of a children's charity Harry had supported for years. The organization worked with kids who had lost parents, a cause obviously close to Harry's heart given his own experience losing his mother. "We're not ending the relationship," the CEO assured him. "But the board has asked that we keep your involvement less visible for the time being. Just until things settle down." Less visible involvement meant Harry couldn't attend the charity's major fundraising gala next month, couldn't speak at their conferences, couldn't be featured in their promotional materials. He would essentially become a silent supporter, contributing money but unable to use his platform to raise awareness for the cause. After that call, Harry walked outside and stood in his garden for a long time. The California sun was bright and warm, but he felt cold inside. This was what exile really meant, not just separation from family, but gradual erosion of his ability to make a difference in the world. Megan found him there an hour later, still standing in the same spot, staring at nothing. "I know what you're thinking," she said, moving to stand beside him. "You're wondering if fighting back is worth it if it means losing the ability to help people." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. "But what if not fighting back means accepting that they get to define who you are?" Megan continued. "What if staying silent now means they win completely?" That afternoon brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. It was from a journalist Harry had known for years, someone who had covered his military service and charitable work with fairness and integrity. "I've been investigating the palace's decision," the journalist said without preamble. "There's more to this story than what's been reported. I think you should know what I've found." They met that evening at a quiet restaurant in a neighboring town. The journalist, Sarah Mitchell, had brought a folder full of documents and notes that painted a very different picture of how King Charles's decision had been made. "This wasn't just about streamlining the monarchy," Sarah explained, keeping her voice low. "According to my sources inside the palace, there was significant pressure from some members of the government and certain royal advisors to take a harder line with you." She showed Harry copies of private correspondence and meeting notes that had been leaked to her by someone inside the royal household. The documents revealed that several senior advisors had been pushing King Charles to make a strong statement about Harry's criticisms of the royal family in his book and various interviews. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to one particular memo. This advisor specifically suggested that grouping the Duke of Sussex with other non-active royals would send a clear message about consequences for public criticism of the family. Harry felt a mixture of vindication and anger as he read through the documents. His father's decision hadn't been the result of careful consideration of what was best for the monarchy. It had been a calculated punishment, designed to send a message not just to Harry but to anyone else who might consider speaking out about their experiences with the royal family. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I have sources telling me that William actually opposed the decision more strongly than has been reported. He apparently had a heated argument with your father about it, saying it was unnecessary and would only make the family look petty." This information about his brother's opposition was both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because it meant William hadn't abandoned him entirely. Infuriating because it confirmed that the decision could have been stopped if enough family members had stood up to King Charles. The most shocking revelation came at the end of their conversation. Sarah had discovered that the decision to group Harry with Andrew hadn't been finalized until after a private meeting between King Charles and several newspaper editors. The editors had apparently suggested that taking a stronger stance against Harry would be popular with certain segments of the public. So the decision was influenced by media executives? Harry asked, struggling to keep his voice level. "It appears so. My source says the meeting was presented as a consultation about public opinion, but it seems the editors were quite forceful in their suggestions." Harry drove home in silence, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. His father hadn't just made a painful family decision, he'd apparently allowed media moguls to influence how the royal family treated its own members. The betrayal felt complete. When Harry shared the information with Meghan that night, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "This changes everything," she said, pacing around their bedroom. "You can't let them get away with this. If you stay silent now, you're essentially accepting that they can manipulate and punish you with impunity." Harry understood her anger, but he also felt trapped. Fighting back would likely make things worse for his charitable work and business ventures. But accepting the situation meant allowing his father and the royal institution to define him on their terms rather than his own. The next morning brought another difficult conversation, this time with the head of the Invictus Games Foundation. The organization was facing pressure from some of its traditional supporters who were uncomfortable with Harry's new status. "We believe in you and what you've built," the foundation head assured him. "But we need to be realistic about the challenges we're facing. Some of our military sponsors are getting nervous." The idea that his father's decision might harm the Invictus Games, an organization that helped wounded veterans heal and inspired people around the world, was the final straw for Harry. The Games represented everything he'd hoped to achieve in his public life: service, compassion, and making a real difference in people's lives. That evening, Harry made a decision that would change the trajectory of his conflict with the royal family. He called Sarah Mitchell and told her he was ready to go on the record with his response to his father's decision and the process that had led to it. "I want people to know the truth about how this really happened," he told her. "Not just the sanitized version the palace put out, but what really went on behind the scenes." It would be his most direct challenge to his father and the royal institution since stepping back from royal duties. But, after seeing how the decision was affecting his charitable work and learning about the manipulative process that had led to it, Harry felt he had no choice but to fight back. The battle lines were being drawn for a conflict that would test not just Harry's resolve, but the royal family's ability to weather a very public challenge from one of its own members. The third phase of this story was ending, but Harry was finally ready to begin writing his own version of what came next. The morning of the interview was crisp and clear, the kind of California day that usually filled Harry with gratitude for the life he'd built. But today, as he sat in makeup preparing for what would likely be the most important television appearance of his life, he felt only a grim determination to set the record straight. Sarah Mitchell had arranged for the interview to be conducted by a respected British journalist known for his fairness and thorough preparation. The questions had been agreed upon in advance, but Harry knew that once the cameras started rolling, the conversation would take on a life of its own. Meghan sat with him in the green room, her presence both calming and energizing. She'd been instrumental in helping him prepare for this moment, pushing him to be direct and honest while remaining dignified. "Remember," she said, squeezing his hand, "you're not doing this for revenge. You're doing this because people deserve to know the truth about how decisions are really made and how family members are really treated." Harry nodded, but part of him wondered if the distinction mattered. Whatever his motivations, this interview would be seen as a direct attack on his father and the monarchy itself. There would be no going back from this moment. The interview began with gentle questions about Harry's life in California and his charitable work. But it quickly moved to the heart of the matter: King Charles's decision to group Harry with Prince Andrew and the process that had led to that choice. "I want to be very clear about something," Harry said, looking directly into the camera. "When I stepped back from royal duties, I did so to protect my family and to build a life where I could serve others without the constraints of royal protocol. I never intended to harm the monarchy or my father." The journalist pressed him about his criticism of the royal family in his book and interviews. Harry's response was measured but firm. "I spoke my truth about my experiences. I never expected that doing so would result in being treated the same as someone who was removed from royal duties due to scandal. The comparison is not just inaccurate, it's deliberately hurtful." Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Harry revealed the information Sarah Mitchell had uncovered about the behind-the-scenes pressure that had influenced his father's decision. "What I learned recently is that this decision wasn't made in isolation by my father," Harry explained. There were advisors pushing for punishment, and there were media executives who apparently had input into how the royal family should treat its own members. The journalist's eyebrows raised slightly. This was news to him, despite his preparation for the interview. Harry continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I can accept that my father disagrees with my choices. I can even accept that he might feel I've damaged the monarchy. But what I cannot accept is learning that his decision was influenced by people outside the family who wanted to see me punished for speaking honestly about my experiences. The interview covered the practical consequences of the king's decision, the impact on Harry's charitable work, the pressure on his business partnerships, and the erosion of his ability to support causes he cared about. Harry was particularly emotional when discussing how the decision might affect the Invictus Games. These are wounded veterans who have sacrificed everything for their countries, he said, his voice breaking slightly. The idea that politics within my family might harm an organization that helps them heal is unconscionable to me. The most powerful moment came when the journalist asked Harry directly what he wanted from his father now. I want him to be a grandfather to his grandchildren, Harry replied without hesitation. I want him to remember that before I was a duke or a prince or a public figure, I was his son. I want him to consider whether the advice he's receiving is really in the best interest of our family or just in the best interest of people who want to see me silenced. The interview also addressed Harry's relationship with William, revealing for the first time the extent of his brother's opposition to their father's decision. William tried to prevent this, Harry said. He understood that it was unnecessarily harsh and would accomplish nothing positive. But he's in an impossible position, caught between supporting his brother and supporting his future role as king. When asked about his future relationship with the royal family, Harry was honest about his uncertainty. I hope there's a path forward, he said. But that path requires acknowledgement that family members shouldn't be punished for honesty, and that decisions about our relationships shouldn't be influenced by people who have their own agendas. The interview aired 3 days later to massive global attention. Within hours, it was clear that Harry's revelations had struck a chord with the public. Social media exploded with support for Harry's position, particularly his point about the inappropriate influence of media executives on royal family decisions. The palace's response was swift but measured. A brief statement expressed disappointment in Harry's decision to make private family matters public but declined to address the specific allegations he'd made about the decision-making process. More significant was the response from other members of the royal family. Within 24 hours of the interview airing, Princess Anne released a statement supporting veterans organizations and specifically mentioning her admiration for the Invictus Games. It was a subtle but clear signal of support for Harry's charitable work. Even more surprising was a phone call Harry received 2 days after the interview aired. It was from his father. Harry, King Charles's voice was tired but not angry. We need to talk. I'm listening, Harry replied, his heart racing. This has gone too far. The damage to all of us, including you, is getting out of hand. I think it's time we found a way forward. The conversation that followed was difficult but productive. King Charles didn't apologize for his original decision, but he acknowledged that the process had been flawed and that Harry's charitable work shouldn't suffer because of family disagreements. I may not agree with all of your choices, the king said, but you're still my son, and your children are my grandchildren. We need to find a way to separate our personal relationship from these institutional conflicts. Over the following weeks, a series of private conversations between Harry, his father, and William led to what palace insiders would later describe as a reset of Harry's status. While he wouldn't return to working royal duties, the language used to describe his situation was changed to distinguish him clearly from Andrew's circumstances. More importantly, there was a quiet understanding that Harry's charitable work would no longer be subject to indirect pressure from the palace. Organizations that worked with Harry found that the royal household was no longer discouraging their partnerships, and several business relationships that had been threatened were restored. The Invictus Games Foundation received a surprise visit from Princess Anne, who attended a planning meeting and made clear her personal support for the organization's mission. It was a signal that not all members of the royal family were united behind the harder line that had been taken against Harry. 3 months after the interview, Harry attended an Invictus Games event in London, his first official appearance in Britain since his father's controversial decision. The reception was overwhelmingly positive, with veterans and their families expressing support for Harry's fight to protect the organization. Most significantly, William attended the same event, sitting with Harry during the opening ceremony and joining him for visits with competitors. The images of the brothers together sent a clear message that while institutional conflicts might continue, their personal relationship was being repaired. The experience had changed Harry in fundamental ways. He'd learned that fighting back against institutional pressure was possible, but that it came with costs and risks that had to be carefully considered. He'd also learned that his relationship with his family was more complex and resilient than he'd sometimes believed. Meghan noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. The angry determination that had driven him to do the interview had been replaced by a calmer confidence. He'd stood up for himself and his values, and, while the battle had been difficult, he'd emerged stronger and more certain of his own path. "I think I finally understand something," Harry told Meghan one evening as they watched their children play in their garden. "I spent so many years trying to be what the institution wanted me to be, and then I spent the last few years reacting against that. But now I think I'm finally becoming who I actually am." The story wasn't over. Harry's relationship with the royal family would always be complicated by the competing demands of personal loyalty and institutional requirements. But he'd learned that he could fight for his values and his family while still maintaining hope for reconciliation. Most importantly, he'd discovered that his worth wasn't determined by his father's approval or the institution's acceptance. His work with veterans, his commitment to his family, and his efforts to make a positive difference in the world had value independent of royal recognition. The boy who'd lost his mother and struggled to find his place had become a man willing to fight for his principles while remaining open to forgiveness and growth. It was perhaps the most royal thing he'd ever done, not because it followed protocol, but because it demonstrated the kind of courage and integrity that true leadership required. The future remained uncertain, but Harry was no longer afraid of that uncertainty. He'd learned to build his own foundation, one that couldn't be shaken by decisions made in palace conference rooms or influenced by people who didn't understand the real stakes involved. The fight was over, but the building of his new life was just beginning.